Okay, I think we will start. Thank you all for coming. My name is Steve Kahn, and I'll introduce myself a little bit later. This is part of a theme of this Congress of history, a history of the field and also history of this organization, the International Federation of Automatic Control. And what you have in front of you are 4 past presidents and IFAC advisors. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. Past president is pretty clear. We're going to try to make this very informal, so we're sitting here rather than standing up there. We're looking for questions as time goes on. The structure will be to have me make some more extensive comments that are related to this book that's in front of you, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So let's start. I'd like to introduce us by name, and then each of us will speak in turn as we wish. But again, informal. We're looking for informality. So none of us are planning to stand up. None of us have slides. This is called a discussion session, and in most conferences that means a series of lectures. In this conference, it means sitting here and talking with you. That's the plan. So Vladimir Kuchera is on my right and your left. He is, as I say, a vice president, former vice president of IFAC, and president of IFAC, in fact, and IFAC advisor. And his presidency was from 2002 to 2005. And the Congress in 2005 was in Prague. Wook Kwon on my left and on your right is from Korea. He is a past president and an advisor. His term of office was 2005 to 2008, and he was responsible for the IFAC Congress in Seoul in 2008. Pedro Albertos is on my right from Spain, a past president and advisor, and was president from 1999 to 2002 with a memorable Congress in Barcelona. My name is Steve Kahn. As I mentioned, I was president of IFAC from 1993 to 1996 and had the pleasure of hosting the Congress in San Francisco in 1996. So we are all past presidents. We are advisors, which was a designation developed late in IFAC's history. We'll talk about that as we go through the history. What this book is a detailed summary of IFAC's history, and we're going to be talking about it. We're not going to talk through it. It's 299 pages. The final version of this book is on the IFAC website and will be there forever. If we have websites forever, that's another problem we have. How are we going to work in the future? The version you have in this book and on the thumb drive, the proceedings of this Congress, is a slightly pre-publication version. So the actual version is the one on the IFAC website, which you can always get to in the future. Okay, so what is this group? Many of you in the audience, we didn't know who this session would attract. Many of you in the audience are part of this history. You created the history. In fact, the past president, as of 2 days ago, of IFAC is sitting right here in the middle with his wife. Jane and Zaitun has just ended his term, which happens at a General Assembly meeting at each Congress, and the new president takes over at that time. So that's some of the technicalities, but where did it all start and how did it start? Well, hardly any of you in the room probably remember when there was something called an Iron Curtain and a Cold War, and a war, indeed, the Second World War. And it was during that period that automatic control took off, if you like. It was, of course, the technologies of automatic control during the Second World War were instrumental in ending the war, especially radar, if you like, and artillery pointing and so on. So there was a lot of technology being developed then, but there wasn't much communication about it because it was secret. Each side had their own had their own developers of this technology. There was, except within each side, there was relatively little discussion among them. they began to use similar science and technology results from the past. So Lyapunov certainly wasn't involved in the Second World War, but he certainly had a big influence on people during the Second World War developing their technologies, unfortunately for war use. That's not such an uncommon trend in our human society, unfortunately, that wars initiate technology developments. In Heidelberg in 1956, there was an international conference. Now, the notion of international conferences was relatively new at that time because people were fighting a war. And after the war, they were repairing themselves. And those of you who are old enough know something about that story. But some people began to think about getting together. Now, getting together at that time was using ships, maybe, to cross the ocean to get to another continent, occasionally using airplanes. But it wasn't an easy thing. Not that it's very easy today either, but it was not easy in other ways at that time. So there were not very many international conferences. There was one in England in the early 50s, which was probably the first one at Cranfield. Then there was one in I think in Rome, but certainly in Italy, a little bit later. And then in Heidelberg in 1956, there was an automatic control conference, an international automatic control conference. People arrived there, many of whom had not met each other, but they knew of each other's work because for the 10 years after the war, there was more sharing of information. But the notion of getting together in international meetings and sharing technologies and science wasn't very common in the engineering and applied fields. Of course, there had been physics conferences and chemistry conferences and so on long before the war. Very few technology conferences before the Second World War started. So a few of the people that came to that meeting were Rufus Oldenburger from the United States. He's a mechanical engineer. Actually, Harold Chestnut did not attend that meeting, which is interesting because, as you know, he became the first president of IFAC. And as you probably remember, his son was here a couple of days ago at the opening ceremony. Gerhard Ruppel was there from Germany. He had been a very active scientific secretary of a major German technical society for a long time, through the wars, as a matter of fact. He was there. Victor Broida from France was there. These are names that will come up later on. They'll come up in the book. We're not going to tell you the whole story here. We're going to highlight a few things, and when you look at the book, you'll see these names pop up and understand exactly how they fit into the scheme of things. Alex Letov from Russia, from the Soviet Union at that time, was there. It was pretty unusual for Russians to be anywhere outside the Soviet Union. And so Letov is an example of someone who was well known by reputation, but not in person. So this group got together for a conference in Heidelberg, and a few of them, in particular Oldenburger and Broida from France, had a notion that maybe some sort of a regular meeting of people like this should take place, but they had no plans to do it. They had no scheduled meeting to plan it. And during the course of a few days in Heidelberg, a few of them got together and started to talk in more detail about the potential of an international organization that might get together regularly, might have journals, might share experiences. And sure enough, at one afternoon in Heidelberg in September of 1956, they did get together. They decided, yeah, we ought to try to do this. In fact, they signed a little agreement that said the following people are committed to try to help set up an organization that might have something to do with automatic control. And at that time, they actually invented the name International Federation of Automatic Control, which you may realize is somewhat of a debatable title of an organization today. But this was 1956. Automatic control was what their experience was, and they decided it would make sense to try to do something. So a steering committee was put together, And they went off, and a year later got together in Paris and agreed to some kind of a modest constitution. There was a big argument about what kind of a constitution or what kind of an organization do we want. I think Oldenburger had an idea of a bit more detail and robust constitution. Broida had a slightly different idea. The Russians are very interested, but didn't know how to do it, and also observed that there were a lot of constraints from their side that might prevent the creation of such an organization. And that's why one of the very first concepts for IFAC was it would not be an organization of individual members. In that time, in the Soviet Union, all the automatic control engineers in the entire country had a single address. It was in Moscow. And there was no permission to correspond outside the country except from that address. So there were some real constraints. And the conclusion was a decision that lives with us today. It has worked very well, but it's unusual in that the members of IFAC, right now there are 49 of them, are national member organizations, one per country. This has added a lot of excitement to the way IFAC has worked, a lot of complications, but also excitement. We'll talk about a little bit of that. One of the interesting things to note is that at that point, there was an East Germany and a West Germany. There was no Germany. And that meant that there was a complication about the definition of one country, and that led to the following strange situation. Rupel was the guy that had the most experience being a general secretary of a professional society in West Germany, in that case. It was concluded by the governments that one couldn't be in a professional international society if the other one was. So that was tough. We had a guy here who was best suited to know how to operate a professional society, but his country, West Germany, was not allowed to be a member of IFAC because of the complication with East Germany. That led to a decision that also is, of course, reflected in the book, that Rupel was the obvious person to be involved in the leadership of IFAC. But he was a member of a country in which they couldn't join. So what finally happened is the West Germans funded Rupel to help with the organization of IFAC at no cost to IFAC, and his title would have to be honorary secretary rather than secretary. So there's a lot of stuff like that in the book. It's kind of fascinating, but it's pretty boring to hear from the stage. So I just alert you to the early pages of the book, have more details about that. This was resolved, of course, about 10 years later. It took almost 10 years for Germany to actually join IFAC, even though it was making major contributions along the way and helped because it was free. Okay, so the concept that the members would be NMOs was established very early. And there was a proposed structure that involved something called an executive council. There was an advisory committee. Now you translate that into executive council into council, advisory committee into technical board. Although actually the technical board didn't come along until the 1980s. We'll talk about that pretty soon. And the ultimate authority would be vested in a general assembly, each NMO being entitled to have one member and one vote in that assembly. And in actual fact, that general assembly this year took place yesterday. Was it yesterday? Or 2 days ago. Anyway, I think it was yesterday. And that's where the officers are elected and changes are made. And so constitutional changes can be made and so on. Okay, so this is now, this little agreement kind of constitution was established in 1958. It was decided that there would be congresses that would be run by the presidents. And the first Congress was to be run by the Russians in 1960, but the first president would be an American that would not have a Congress. So this is a real, you can imagine this kind of compromise going on, and that American would be Hal Chestnut, whose granddaughter is sitting in the room somewhere here. And the cycle of changes would be every 2 years, because this was 1958. The first Congress would be in 1960, that's 2 years later. So the decision was made that there would be 2-year terms. And Hal Chestnut served for 2 years. Letov served for, now the 2 years were 1957 to 1959, because actually this started in late 57. So there's a little complication there at the beginning. As time went on, and as the preparation for the Congress went on, which was actually essentially the only business of IFAC for its first 2 years, can we get a Congress in Moscow? If you think about security issues at this Congress, think about what it was in those days. And the entire IFAC operation was focused on creating a Congress in Moscow and changing the presidency at that time to the Russian, so Letov could be chairman of that Congress. So Chestnut had no Congress and served for 2 years. Then, actually, from the middle of 1958, I was wrong about 57. Middle of 1958 to the middle of 1960, it was Chestnut as president, and then Letov as president as the Congress started. And he went for 2 years until Gericke from Switzerland was elected following, in 1962, Letov stepping down. So we had these 2-year terms, Chestnut and Letov and Gericke, who was a distinguished professor at ETH at Zurich, a control specialist. A few people here probably knew him. And then by that time, it was realized that we can't run these meetings, these congresses every 2 years. A lot of other organizations were getting started. They were using a 2-year cycle. The confusion and the interference would be too much. And so the decision was made someplace along the line, and I forget when it is, but it's in the book. It was made to go to 3-year terms. So it was in 1963 that the change was made to have 3-year terms with a 3-year president and a Congress every 3 years. And in the meantime, some other technical stuff, 2 or 3 meetings. They call them symposia in those days. They still call some of our meetings symposia. And those would be scattered around, and it was very informal, and the whole operation of IFAC was concentrated now on developing these meetings, some of which were congresses. What has become the technical board was called the Advisory Committee. It's interesting that Boris Petrov, the chief of the Soviet space program, was the chairman of the Advisory Committee of IFAC, its first chairman. Very prominent people were getting involved in the organization at that time. There were a group of technical committees. There were 5, if I recall: theory, applications, terminology, components, and something else. So you say terminology. Well, remember at this time, people hadn't talked to each other very much. So they discovered that they were using different terms to describe the same control concepts around the world. So there was a big effort on terminology, and IFAC actually produced a couple of multilingual glossaries to remind people of what the different words were in the different fields. And it's interesting to note that, well, not bother. There are a lot of interesting things that came up as a result of that, because there were some existing quasi-multilingual glossaries that were in existence, but they didn't involve all the languages IFAC wanted to involve. And IFAC has had and has 4 official languages: English, French, German, and Russian. And in the early days, the proceedings of the IFAC Congress in Moscow were in two languages. There was a Russian version and there was an English version. And that, again, that's described in the book also. A lot of translation costs. Can you imagine going to a Congress? It'd be like the UN, where there's simultaneous translations going on, earphones being worn, and so on. So a very different world at that time. These, incidentally, these five technical committees now have turned into 42 over the history, and how that happened is described also in the book. There were questions about publications. IFAC did not have publications then. In fact, when they had meetings, including congresses, they were published and produced locally. So after a while, it was very hard to find these publications, and in actual fact, that led to a major publications program that really got underway in the 70s. We had a couple of anniversaries, both up to this one. The 25th and the 50th were both held in Heidelberg at the time, at the place, and actually in the month in which IFAC was formed 25 and 50 years beforehand. The publications discussion is pretty thorough in the book. It involved Robert Maxwell, who those of you from Great Britain may have heard of. He was a very controversial figure there. He, if you'll excuse the comparison, was a bit of a Donald Trump kind of guy. He owned a football team. He was a member of parliament. He was an immigrant to England. And his story is in a book called Maxwell, which describes it all. I'm certainly not going to tell you about that. But it was very important to have this interaction between IFAC and a commercial publisher, which was called Pergamon Press at that time, because of the finances, the amount of money that was required to set this up. And IFAC was a very poor organization in those days. It had really no way to generate money. There were all kinds of non-convertible currencies that people could use or couldn't use, or transfer or couldn't transfer. And to get anything done financially was almost impossible. There's only a little bit of that problem left. There is a little bit of it, but not much. So after settling in and spending up to almost 20 years, maybe 15 years, it was clear that some stabilization had to be put into the system. The number of symposia were growing. The interest in this technology was growing all over the world. People were communicating more. They were going to local meetings. They were going to national meetings, and occasionally they'd go to an international meeting that IFAC ran. There were series of symposia set up, usually on a 3-year cycle, but not always. It was very ad hoc, and every time there was a meeting, there was a local printer and publisher, just let's call him a printer, a friend of the NMO chairman, who did whatever had to be done for preprints or proceedings. But then it was observed, we can't track these things anymore. That publisher went out of business, and there are no hard copies. There were no, everything was hard copy, of course. There were no copies of materials except in some professor's office somewhere. So it was getting pretty chaotic. That was fixed in some way by having occasional indices published, but they were very temporary and not very accurate and so on. The actual publication story, there's an entire chapter on publications in the IFAC story, ended up with a formal agreement between Pergamon Press and IFAC, signed in 1976 in Udine, just after a major earthquake in that part of Italy, so there was a little nervousness even about having the council meet there. It was not a Congress year, but there was some concern about whether we could actually go to Udine. We did, and it was wonderful. A contract was signed with Elsevier, a contract that with Pergamon. Pergamon was later purchased by Elsevier. Those contracts have been signed every 3 to 5 to 6 years ever since. There was a management board set up to run this. There was a thought that there should be a separate group handling the finances of publications as opposed to the intellectual content, the former being done by this managing board and the latter being done strictly by IFAC. And in the meantime, there had been some discussion of IFAC having a journal. Actually, Maxwell proposed to IFAC in the very early 60s that IFAC take over a existing commercial journal within Pergamon called Automatica, and IFAC felt that was a little bit too much to handle at that stage of its development. So anyway, finally, by 1976, this publication scheme got going. Public proceedings were published more consistently, uniform standards, the covers looked similar. You could go to the library and find a few of them, and that's gone on until now, where we have all online publications, very successful journals. The publications business of IFAC generates approximately 2/3 of its income. So it really stabilized the finances of IFAC, and that has continued very successfully. We can come back to some of that later if you have any questions. Just want to mention a couple of other major activities within IFAC. One is pre-college classes that are run by the Education Committee of IFAC, dealing with kids in high schools around the world in the location of IFAC meetings, which is an initiative that started about 20 years ago and has now been very successful. There's a section in the book about that. And the other is the IFAC Foundation. There had been a discussion for a long time, starting in the early 80s or maybe even late 70s, about the desirability of having a foundation that could help finance IFAC-related activities. And this was discussed. There were task forces, and a lot of activity went on, but without any money to speak of. So it was in the year 2000, early in the year 2000, an individual within IFAC, Professor Kwon, asked if money that he might provide could be used to really get the foundation going. And the answer was yes. And this has been a remarkably important event in our history. And now there's an IFAC Foundation running. At the closing ceremony, you'll see an award being given by the IFAC Foundation, and you'll learn more about that later. I think I'm going to now slow down, or stop actually, and I'd like to ask Vladimir to start, maybe talking a little bit about what it was like to look at an IFAC from the East Bloc and then how that's evolved. Vladimir, please.
Thank you, Steve. I have my notes here because, okay. So, as was explained already, IFAC was conceived in 1956 and born in 1957. And that was the time when the field of automatic control emerged, and it was under the unfavorable circumstances of the Cold War. Europe was divided into the West and the East. The division was symbolized by the Iron Curtain. The natural communication of the automatic control community was hampered. The scientists and engineers therefore called for an international organization to help to ease the situation and to promote a natural collaboration across barriers. And the key point, as already mentioned in this respect, was an agreement coined at the birth of IFAC already, namely a certain balance between the United States and the Soviet Union in IFAC leadership. The first president was an American, while the first Congress was in Moscow. Then I can say that the two powers started, in a sense, to trust each other, and collaboration became feasible. The countries of Central and Eastern Europe, like Poland, Hungary, or Czechoslovakia at the time, were happy to follow and contributed to the development of IFAC in quite an important manner. For example, Warsaw hosted the 4th IFAC Congress, Budapest the 9th IFAC Congress, whereas the preparations for a Congress in Prague were disrupted by the military intervention in 1968, unfortunately. These countries in the center and east of Europe were among the first, in fact, to establish their national member organizations of IFAC. Professional organizations like VDI, VDE in Germany were not yet in place. So national committees were created ad hoc in lieu of standard professional organizations. The membership of IFAC grew as follows. First, the USSR, Poland and Hungary became members in 1957. Czechoslovakia and Romania in 1958, Bulgaria and Yugoslavia in 1960. Then, following the breakdown of the Soviet Union, of Yugoslavia, and also of Czechoslovakia, the emerging countries of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Croatia, Macedonia, Slovenia, as well as Slovakia, joined IFAC mainly in 1993. Yes, Kosovo followed in 2009. So, the activity of the Central and Eastern European countries was reflected not only in the growing number of IFAC events hosted, but also in the growing number of personalities who served IFAC as officers. Already mentioned, Letov from the USSR was the second IFAC president. Nowatzki from Poland was also president of IFAC. These two were also present at the Heidelberg meeting in 1956 among the signatories of the resolution in favor of IFAC. Others from this part of the world present were Mesarovic from Yugoslavia, Straits and Hanuš from Czechoslovakia. Other people then contributed substantially to the IFAC development. In addition to Letov and Nowatzki being presidents of IFAC, was Tibor Vámos from Hungary, Boris Tam from the USSR, or Estonia if you wish, technically speaking. At that time it was still USSR, where he was the president. And also Beneš, Jiří Beneš from Czechoslovakia was a vice president, and Gustav Henčej, by the way, was a secretary. Probably, I'm not sure whether he was still honorary secretary, but to be sure he was a secretary at the time. My own activities in IFAC date back to Paris in 1972. This was my first Congress to attend, so this one is the 16th already in a row. I missed only the first 4 Congresses. And I was invited to become a member of the theory committee. Then in Munich, in '87, I was elected a council member, and then in Barcelona, 2004, president, and so on. I'm pleased to say that IFAC has been an important part of my life. I appreciate the role played by IFAC during the times of Cold War, and of course I'm happy that IFAC plays its modern role of leading professional or international organization in the field of automatic control. Yeah.
I like to mention about the IFAC in Asia, even if it's not that strongly related in the old days. But as you know, Asia is the largest and most populous continent in the world. Asia has about 45 countries. China, India, world biggest two country. But GDP or gross domestic product per capita is low, mostly, except with the exception of a few countries. Asia consists of East Asia, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and we call West Asia, but they often called Middle East. All are very different in culture and society. Among 45 countries, 16 countries has joined IFAC once. When IFAC was founded in 1958, China, Japan, Israel, and Turkey, 4 countries joined, and the next year India joined. Since then, 11 more countries have joined IFAC. But now, only 8 countries, such as China, Japan, Israel, India, South Korea, Singapore, and Malaysia, stay as IFAC NMO. Another 8 countries, like North Korea, Kuwait, Pakistan, Hong Kong, Indonesia, Vietnam, Bahrain, left IFAC for some reasons. So it was interesting to investigate why they left IFAC, even if they like IFAC's activity. There are many reasons, but I found financial situation in Asia may be the most important factor. As I mentioned, the per capita GDP, gross domestic product, is very low. Each country has different problem. I checked the China, Japan, how can they distribute it? I mean, obtained the IFAC membership fee. I found they are supported by government, so no problem. All the Asian NMO, they have their own technical society. It's not that active, so it is difficult to raise the membership fee. This is our situation. I thought maybe a country should have around at least 5,000 per capita GDP, 5,000 US dollar, and the population could be around at least 5 million to be a reasonable IFAC NMO. Those 8 countries who left the IFAC belong to this category. The per capita GDP is lower than $5,000, and the population is smaller than 5 million people. So there are some reasons. So you have to work hard to solve this problem. I'd like to also mention about the IFAC and Asian community about the control activity. Joint control activity in Asia was not that active until 1994. During that period, Asian control science and engineer was very much influenced by IFAC, particularly from attending IFAC Congress, very impressive Congress, many. Asian had IFAC Congress only in 1981, the first one in Kyoto, Japan. All this kind of activity motivated to create Asian Control Conference in 1992. First thing they did was the agreement with IFAC. First thing, to cooperate or to get help from the IFAC. So in 1993, next year, the Asian Control Conference had the Friendship Night in World Congress Sydney. They invited leading IFAC officials. At that time, Brian Anderson was president. This indicates Asian community is really like to cooperate with IFAC. So then in 1994, we finally had the Asian Control Conference in Tokyo, Japan. Since then, we are proud to have many Congress like after Japan, Korea, China, Singapore, Australia, Indonesia, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Turkey, and Malaysia. So this kind of activity could be possible, I believe, from the influence of the IFAC. Then the Asian Control Professors Association was created to support the Asian Journal of Control in 1996, and later, finally, Asian Control Association was created in 2006 to support or take care of all this activity. They take care of the Asian Control Conference, they take care of Asian Journal of Control, also education of these issues. So we are now operated under Asian Control Association. I believe this kind of activity definitely will increase the participation to IFAC. So it will be good for IFAC because they have a very good image about IFAC. For example, when the IFAC Congress 2008 was held in Seoul, at that time we had a prior schedule to have Asian Control Conference at the same year, but we decided to postpone 1 year Asian Control Conference to 2009. This is cooperation is possible. So I'd like to mention one thing. In IFAC, based on the NMO, one NMO from one country, in Asia, we have a problem. As you see, Hong Kong, at that time, was not part of, could be part of China or could be independent. But Taiwan has always a problem. So when we created Asian Control Association or Asian Control Conference Steering Committee, we decided membership depend on individual, like IEEE, but operated based on country. For example, the Exec Committee of Asian Control Association, we invite one from every country, at most 3 from biggest country like China or Japan. So by doing this way, the people from Hong Kong, people from Taiwan freely participate our activity. So it's very special structure. Maybe we learn from the IFAC also. I like to make one joke. The Constitution of South Korea states that North Korean territory belong to South Korea, but South Korean support independent international activity of North Korea. We even like to support North Korea to join IFAC financially or any other support. So this, only I would like to make one point. IFAC introduced the so-called reduced fee memberships, the new memberships, to help those countries who are not that strong in financial situation. I found among 45 Asian countries, almost half, maybe 21 countries belong to the eligible class of reduced fee membership. So I hope in the future more Asian participation will be possible. This is
Good afternoon, everyone. As you realize, IFAC is the result of the history. And no one of us here is a member of IFAC. IFAC is a federation of societies belonging to each country. And this makes a big difference with respect to other associations or federations. In particular, one of the main characteristics of IFAC is diversity. The Congress we are having here in Toulouse has nothing to do with the Congress we had in Tallinn or the one we had in any other country. It depends very much on the particularity of the people organizing the Congress. But it's not only the Congress. Everything is very diverse. And I think that this is one of the main characteristics and interesting things in IFAC. We don't have rules determined by the idiosyncrasy of any country, not from USA, not from Germany, not from South Korea. So the rules are general, and the way we interpret the rules are different in each occasion. Of course, this also makes some differences, as Professor Kwon mentioned, that some small countries cannot be members of the federation. You have seen also in the previous talks that the origin of IFAC was not very clear, and the number of members was not clear. They were adding and adding. In the last years, we are fixed around 50 national member organizations. And as Professor Kwon mentioned also, we are looking for some other kinds of participations, reduced fee members, in order to attract the activity in other parts of the world. In fact, one of the activities of the IFAC Foundation, which was due mainly to the generosity of Professor Kwon, is to organize regional courses. We had 3 until now, one in Southeast Asia, another in Central America, and another one in North Africa. And the idea is to promote the control and to make people interested in IFAC. This kind of organization has also another interesting thing. The infrastructure of IFAC is very small. The secretariat of IFAC is composed by 3 people that they are working every day in Luxembourg, in Austria, and they don't receive visits from many people, and all the activity is developed by volunteers, which are all around the world. And they are organized, as you know, in technical committees and executive committees and different congresses, different symposia and workshops, and all this activity is distributed. But not only the activity, also the finances. And this is also quite important to point out. IFAC finances are not involved in the organization of the events. IFAC controls the quality of the event, but doesn't control the economy, the finances. So the responsibility of the finances relies on the NMO, which is in charge of this event. I think this has very good influence, because we can say that IFAC, we can say, but it's not true, but IFAC is not interested in money, in the sense that we are not doing activities in order to get money. Our finances, as Professor Kahne mentioned, are mainly based on publications and also the fees paid by the NMOs. And all the activities developed all around the world, and I think in the last triennium there were more than 99, almost 100 meetings, workshops and symposia, all them run independently from a finance point of view from IFAC. But IFAC controls the quality of all this. Another point that I would like to mention is that in the origin, IFAC was seen just as the federation of NMOs. And during the last years, we have been trying to emphasize the acting role of the people in IFAC. So we created different awards, and we created different figures like the fellowship, advisors, and so on, in such a way that one person can be feel more linked to IFAC than just being a member of the local association, which is a part of the NMO or something like that. And we, in this sense, we have developed a number of awards, and this is good, but this is also a bit boring at the time of the Congress, because we, as IFAC, we only meet once every 3 years. And at this time, we should recognize all the people and all the persons that have been working for IFAC in this triennium. And going to the geographical activities, I want to mention that the number of NMOs in Latin America has been also changing a lot during the time. Some countries became NMOs, and after some years and some trienniums, don't pay the fee, they were removed. But I think this is really a problem of economy and the crisis in all these countries. But in this area, they are also quite well organized. They have a Latin American Control Conference, which is organized by a country which is member of IFAC. So in this sense, they have a good link also to IFAC. And we ask everyone in contact with these countries to let them know that IFAC is open to participate with all of them, to organize events, either directly or through the neighbor NMO, and to become also reduced fee members. So the aim of IFAC is to be the worldwide organization bringing together specialists from all the world around. Thank you.
Just to wrap up, if you are saying to yourself, that sounds like kind of an interesting organization, how could I get involved? It's very easy. We have 44 technical committees. Any individual can contact the chairman of that technical committee and say, I would be interested in participating, maybe as a reviewer of papers or in some role. That's the normal entry into IFAC activities. So, and that's a big change, I should say, from a historical point of view. There were times in which you would apply to your NMO and they would evaluate you and decide whether or not they would send your name forward. That changed about 25 years ago, but I expect there's 1 or 2 people in this room right now today that didn't know that. So it's quite easy to get involved, usually through the technical route. There are a set of other committees and activities, but normally people have come in that way. One other comment, just picking up on what was said, there have been 72 different countries as having NMOs and IFAC at one time or another, and now there are 49. So the dynamics of what you've heard from other people here affect that. This was kind of an experiment to see if there would be an interest in learning about IFAC. The book is available to you. This is not the final version. The final version is online at the website, and the IFAC website, and will be there forever. But this may be a nice gift for you, and it was our former president who decided that this might be a nice way to make the presentation, as well as this panel discussion and a few other panel discussions coming up on IFAC history. So thank you very much for coming, and enjoy the Congress.